Well, the northern Victorian town of Shepparton is facing devastating flooding tomorrow morning as the region braces for the Goulburn River to hit a record peak. Meanwhile, the Mickleham COVID quarantine facility will open this week to shelter Victorians whose homes have been destroyed by floods which have gripped the state. Today, the Prime Minister and the Victorian Premier pledged to immediately pay $500,000 to 24 local government areas which have been hit by this flooding. Anthony Albanese was in Bendigo today and announced a package which includes a one-off, non-means tested payment of $1,000 per adult and $400 per child. Joining me now live from Maribyrnong to bring you the latest is Sky News Melbourne reporter Georgia Simpson. Georgia, thank you for this. How much damage have these floods in and around metropolitan Melbourne caused?
Chris, it's pretty extensive, but the most significant damage is definitely around the inner northwest suburb of Maribyrnong. You can clearly see the street behind me. There is just so much damage done. We're told about an estimated 200 homes were inundated with water, so you can just imagine the incredible cleanup that is ahead of people who live in this area. This street that I'm standing on Friday, my head would have been underwater. So just to give you an idea of how much water came through here, yeah, it's quite significant. So, look, I'm told that in this particular area, it wasn't as bad as the 1974 floods, but it definitely was on par with the floods in the early 90s. And look, as I mentioned, you can clearly see behind me, there is a lot of work to be done for those people whose homes were severely inundated.
Now, for people in northern Victoria, in areas such as Shepparton, as I mentioned, they're looking at serious flooding to come, are they, tomorrow?
Yeah, that's right. So the Goulburn River at Shepparton is expected to peak tomorrow at 12.2 metres. So that exceeds the 1974 flood levels of 12.09 metres. So that is the worst flood that the Shepparton area has experienced in more than 50 years. I'm told that evacuation alerts and orders have been in place for a number of hours. They've been coming thick and fast. But despite this, there are still hundreds of residents who, for whatever reason, decided to ignore those orders, and they're now staying in Shepparton. It's too late to leave. So the advice from the Commissioner was to just move to the highest point in your home possible or to the highest ground possible, and to be prepared to be cut off for at least 48 to 72 hours. Also of note, Chris, is the Murray River at Echuca on the Victorian-New South Wales border. That's expected to have two peaks. So it's expected to peak today at 96 metres, a bit over, and then again tomorrow or Tuesday at 95 metres. So it's quite significant. It's very widespread, and it's absolutely far from over.
And nearby from Shepparton, Maribyrnong, there's a power station that's also been inundated with water, and they have power out now for several days, which will be awful for people living there. There are people also in all sorts of evacuation headquarters across the state, and some to move into headquarters on Tuesday. Give us a sense of how those who've lost their homes are being cared for.
Yeah, that's right. So there's more than a dozen service or evacuation centres set up across the state, and you can imagine that in areas like Rochester and Seymour, where there's been quite a lot of water through there and large-scale evacuations, they'd be pretty full. So for those people, as I mentioned, it'd be pretty full. You mentioned before, Chris, that the Mickleham quarantine facility, it was shut a week ago, but it's going to be back online, and 250 beds will be made available for Victorians whose homes have been inundated by flood waters. They'll be provided with 3 meals a day. They'll be allowed to bring their pets if they're contained or on a lead, and they'll be able to stay there for as long as needed. The Premier, Daniel Andrews, said that it's obviously not for everybody, especially given the geographical location and the widespread area of the floods in Victoria, but if there is more appetite for more beds, then a further 250 beds will be available at the Mickleham facility.
It's ironic that more people will use this facility in one day than used it for the entirety of the pandemic. But anyway, lastly, most people I've seen being interviewed today and have appeared on Sky News don't recall floods of this kind in Victoria before. What are residents saying to you, and what's the Victorian government doing about that?
It kind of varies, Chris, depending on who you're speaking to and where you're speaking to. So in places like regional Victoria, Shepparton, for example, it's the worst flooding there in 50 years. Here in Maribyrnong, I've spoken to residents that have lived here for 20 years, and they say they've never seen anything as bad as what they've experienced. But then I've also spoken to people who have lived here since the 50s and 60s, and they say that the 1974 floods that hit Melbourne then were far worse. So it appears to be quite varied and quite widespread. The Victorian government have announced a few early packages. You mentioned before that for people in Bendigo, there are those one-off payments, $1,000 that won't be means tested. There's the immediate payment of $2,000, and the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, estimates about 9,000 people will be eligible to apply for those. They also said that this is evolving, it isn't over, and it could get worse, and that in the coming days they will be announcing further support packages for those residents who have been impacted.
Well, that's reassuring. Great coverage. Thank you for that, Georgia.